That's a grudgin'. Oh, that's a grudgin'. That's most definitely a grudgin'.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're diving into Leagues of Votann for today's faction preview article for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. And like some of the other ones we've gotten so far, this one is pretty weird. It shows a lot of pretty dramatically adjusted profiles for this faction, but without a lot of the context that will really allow us to evaluate them appropriately. Most of the faction mechanics for Leagues of Votann have been entirely reworked, and we're going to have to evaluate them based on their new merits rather than their old. This might be one of the most transformed factions, not necessarily in exactly how they play, but exactly how their mechanics will operate on the table. And I think, honestly, it will just take some games on the table to really decide exactly how good they are. So let's dive into exactly what's different in the new edition of the game with this faction. One of the first big changes that we have is to their Eye of the Ancestors ability. This was their ability in 9th edition to accrue judgment tokens on enemy units over a variety of different criteria, whether they were standing on objectives, performing actions, destroying Leagues of Votann units, in line of sight of high calls. It was just kind of a mess. Every judgment token that the enemy had gave you the equivalent of lethal hits on ever-increasing hit rolls, from 6s up to 4s, meaning that those 6s through 4s to hit automatically converted into wound rolls, so even low or mid-strength Votann shooting could punch through and start dealing damage to heavily armored targets. Now, Eye of the Ancestors can accrue only up to 2 judgment tokens, but each one gives you a pretty impactful effect. The first one giving +1 to hit against that target, and the second being +1 to wound. Now, the fact that the Eye of the Ancestors ability only stacks up to 2 tokens means that maxing out its effect is going to be a lot easier than the 9th edition mechanic was. But obviously, its effect is going to be slightly less impactful. Automatically converting all your hits into wounds was a huge deal in a lot of situations, and now it's just going to give you a better chance to wound. With that in mind, though, a lot of the profiles that we're going to be talking about in this article basically assume that you will be targeting units affected by Eye of the Ancestors. It is a little bit more difficult to apply these judgment tokens, however, since your opponent's army doesn't accrue them passively for holding objectives. Instead, they will only get one every time they destroy a Votann unit. So you're probably going to be building in some disposable units that you can use to range out, grab objectives, and force your opponent to kill them in order to start things off with judgment. It hasn't been shown off yet, but there is the potential that we have other ways to apply the judgment tokens besides just losing units. Leaders like Calls could put them on at this command phase like they do currently. We could have things like Hearthkyn Pioneers use their scout mechanics to move forward and put judgment tokens on enemies. We just don't know. The other way to get judgment tokens is through the Oathband detachment ability. This is going to be the detachment that is available to the faction at the start of 10th edition and gives them the Ruthless Efficiency rule. This automatically assigns 2 judgment tokens to a unit in your opponent's army at the start of the battle. Then, if it's destroyed, grants you command points in your command phase based on how quickly it was killed in the game. This only triggers once per game, but we do get a little bit of an answer to an open question that we've had previously, which is whether or not there is a cap on the regeneration of command points. And apparently it is remaining at 1. Units like Abaddon that have the potential to play aggressively and generate multiple command points a turn actually, in fact, cannot, which, honestly, in terms of Abaddon, it's probably a good balancing factor, but man, I was kind of hoping he could get 2 for shooting and fighting in a turn. Having a CP regen cap also makes discounted stratagems like the ones that we see in Space Marines with Rites of Battle and Gilliman's aura way more valuable, since those are not command point regen. They just use your stratagems for free, so they basically overcome the limit. That said, in this case, if the unit targeted by Ruthless Efficiency at the start of the game was destroyed by your first or second command phase, so somewhere within the first battle round, then you'll gain 3 CP in your next command phase. If it's destroyed in the start of your third or fourth battle round, so sometime in the mid game, you will get 2 CP, and if it's destroyed at the end of the game, you will get 1 CP. This has the potential to give Votann a huge glut of CP at the start of the game, which is good because they will have some reactive effects that they'll be able to use them on. Alongside effects like Oath of Moment that target big bricks, this honestly feels like a little bit of another mechanic that punishes large and aggressive units. So if you have something like 10 Terminators running up the table with a bunch of character support, Votann can just dump 2 judgment tokens on them and get +1 to hit and wound against that unit for the entirety of the game. If you have towering units that can be seen through obscuring terrain, a Votann army can immediately throw 2 judgment tokens on them and light them up with anti-tank shooting from Hekaton land fortresses or Brokir Thunderkin. Well, I don't doubt that it's not going to be too difficult to apply 2 judgment tokens to other units over the course of the game, and especially aggressive and offensive-oriented units are going to be killing Votann units and gaining those judgment tokens themselves. This definitely gives Votann a pretty solid way to answer big defensive bricks in the early game before any of their units are destroyed. Obviously, there is a lot of counterplay, but it's going to be the trick of the Votann player to target the opponent's unit that they can least afford to hide in the back. It being chosen at the beginning of the game as well has some interesting implications for just use as a CP regeneration mechanic. For example, if your opponent has scouts or other forward operators in the front of the table, you can just start the game off by targeting them with Ruthless Efficiency, and if you kill them immediately, you're going to gain that 3 CP. It's a pretty interesting ability, and while it's not particularly flashy, to be honest, I think it does mesh well with the Judgment Token mechanic, especially now that Votann have lost a lot of their other support. These are the only abilities that we're seeing, so we don't get the absolute smorgasbord of sub-faction abilities that Votann had in the 9th edition Codex, where they would get 2 to 3 sub-faction rules, then an additional Eye of the Ancestors rule that would trigger when your opponent had judgment tokens. It's definitely not entirely going to make up for the loss of all of those different rules, but it certainly helps. So what units are benefiting from these abilities? The first one that was shown off is the Hearthkyn Warriors. And these have had an enormous redesign basically from the ground up, moving up to toughness 5, which honestly makes sense. Felt a little bit low toughness in the previous version. Retaining their 4+ save and 1 wound, a relatively low leadership value of 7, but that high OC value of 2 being a mainline battle line unit. They have the Eye of the Ancestors faction ability and the ability Luck Has, Need Keeps, Toil Earns. I kind of like the saying here, but it is a little annoying that we went from adding universal special rules back into the game to making a universal special rule that a bunch of things have, but has different names across each faction. Because this is straight up just the Shock Troopers ability that we saw in Astra Militarum, and the ability that we see in Chaos Demons when they spend a command point to corrupt an objective. I'm gonna start calling this objective secured. They can secure an objective and you hold it until your opponent comes and take it, because the area's been secured. That's what they should have called it. I don't know why they didn't. I don't know. It is what it is. The Hearthkyn are also able to equip their variety of specialists in the unit, taking a pan-spectral scanner, which gives the entire unit ignore cover, a comms array, which again is the same mechanic that we see from Astra Militarum Cadian squads, because it's just the Vox mechanic, where you regen CP on a 5+ when you spend them on Hearthkyn Warriors. I was a little bit excited that this might showcase a sub-theme of CP regen for Astra Militarum, but it looks like that might just be sort of a core mechanic that they're using to represent communication equipment. I almost wonder if we'll see the same thing on something like Infiltrators that have that little communications headset. The meta pack grants the unit a 6+ damage ignore roll, a feel no pain, and the Weave Field Crest gives the bearer a 4+ invulnerable save. I saw some people mention that this would grant the entire unit a 4+ invulnerable save. It's definitely only the Thane inside the unit. That guy specifically can tank big hits on his invuln save. The rest of the unit is going to have to save on their 4+ save. Now, importantly, as we can see here, the Void Armor ability that prevents rerolls and grants an Armor of Contempt effect to the Hearthkyn Warriors is entirely gone. These guys are a lot easier to kill, despite that extra point of toughness, than you would expect from playing them in 9th edition. Unfortunately for them, also has its base offensive stats reduced too. As we can see across the ballistic skill value of all of their weapon options, their ballistic skill and weapon skill basically has all been reduced. Randomly, they've also been made worse in melee too. They used to have 2 base attacks hitting on 3s, now they have 1 base attack hitting on 4s. But I think this speaks to the fact that I imagine in order to fuel the judgment token effect and force your opponent to shoot at your unit, these guys will be a relatively inexpensive MSU or almost horde unit. Hearthkyn Warriors were kind of expensive and mostly in there just to build patrols out and provide some objective security to the Votann army, but now I can imagine them being much more of an integral part of how the faction works, because you're going to need inexpensive units in order to force your opponent to engage with you and accrue judgment tokens, so your bigger guns can do more damage to their army. Basically, all the weapon systems here, I think, are assumed to have judgment tokens active on whatever they're shooting. If that's the case, then they all hit on 3s or 4s, but potentially with a bonus from the heavy keyword, assuming you can stack hit modifiers, which I kind of assume that you can, because otherwise the heavy weapon mechanic would be not very good, which makes their accuracy a lot more palatable. So moving down the line, we see their standard autarch pattern bolters, firing 2 shots out to 24 inches at strength 4, AP 0. Alternatively, they can take the ion blaster, which has moved down to 1 damage from 2, but retains its strength 5, AP 2, and 18-inch range. And then they have a selection of special and heavy weapons, including the plasma beamer, granting sustained hits on D3, so D3 additional hits on a critical hit, which is usually a 6, at strength 8, AP 3, 2 damage. The Hylas auto rifle, which has both the assault and rapid fire attributes, firing an additional 3 shots at 12 inches, which it's able to get into more easily because it's able to advance and fire without penalty. That's a good example of why the sort of granulization of all of these weapon mechanics is a good thing for the diversity of weapons in the game, because you can now start to mesh these special rules together in interesting ways to create new and unique weapons. The Hylas rotary cannon is a heavy weapon that base only hits on 5s, so it is going to be trying to use the heavy mechanic to stand still and gain +1 to hit, but fires 6 shots with 1 sustained hit at strength 6, AP 1. You could also take the L7 missile launcher, able to fire D6 strength 4 blast attacks, or a single focused shot at strength 9, AP 2, D6 damage. Last but certainly not least, and definitely the spiciest one in the list, is the Magna Rail Rifle, which has been kind of bizarrely reduced in range down to 18 inches. We see the rail rifle mechanic returned in the form of devastating wounds, converting its damage to mortal wounds on a critical wound roll, so a 6+. Not only will that ignore all saves and invulnerable saves, but it will then also split its D3+3 damage out into individual packets, so it can spall and kill a bunch of infantry. It comes in at a strength 12 AP 3 profile, but just like the rotary cannon, also hits on 5s unless you use that heavy characteristic to stand still and shoot at +1. In close combat, they're only 1 attack at strength 4, but they have a melee weapon profile that most likely the Thane will get access to, giving them 2 attacks at strength 5, AP 2, 2 damage. Now this is a huge change to this unit. They're worse in basically every metric just based on the core datasheet itself. But again, I have to imagine that this unit is going to be small and it's going to be relatively inexpensive, so that you can put them on forward objectives, you can run them kind of aggressively forward and accrue judgment on your opponent's army if they elect to kill them. In addition, those offensive stats look a lot better once they have those judgment tokens accrued, so definitely I don't think the sky is falling with this one. One of the ways they can get up the table, though, is inside a Hekaton land fortress. A lot of the core stats of the land fortress have remained the same. It retains its 10-inch move and 2+ save, as well as 16 wounds. It has an objective control value of 5, which is basically what it got in Greater Thurian League in the 9th edition codex, and has a leadership value of 7. It did move up to toughness 12, however, putting it up in that upper echelon of main battle tank style vehicles. Not the super heavy category of Bane Blades and Monoliths, but still going to put basically all anti-tank weapons in the game to wounding it on 4s. Speaking of those anti-tank weapons, this thing is packing a ton of them. I should mention, however, that obviously, like other vehicles, it does not bracket in the same way that it did previously. Once it's down to 5 wounds remaining, it will get -1 in its attack rolls, but otherwise it's going to be hitting on 4s regardless of its remaining wounds. It also doesn't reduce its objective control value, because I guess it's below whatever the cutoff ends up being, probably 20 wounds. For the available turret weapons, it's able to take a heavy Magna Rail cannon, a 30-inch range weapon, coming in at a pretty impressive strength 18, AP 4 for D6 plus 6 damage, with, again, the same mechanic that we saw on the Magna Rail rifle, the devastating wounds characteristic. This one is also heavy, so if the land fortress stands still, it will gain +1 to hit, and while it doesn't ignore invulnerable saves entirely, that devastating wounds will punch through invulnerable saves, converting all of that damage to mortals. Devastating wounds is basically the same as the spall mechanic that the rail weapons had in the last version of the codex. The difference now is that they don't automatically ignore vulns. The SP Heavy Conversion Beamer is a 24-inch range weapon, shooting 2 times its strength 10 AP2 4 damage, but it has a new conversion mechanic. The conversion mechanic triggers if the weapon is firing more than 12 inches away from the attacker and grants critical hits on hit rolls of a 4+. Given that the conversion beamer has at base sustained hits D3, each of those 2 attacks that rolls a 4+ to hit will gain D3 additional automatic hits that will then roll to wound at AP2 4 damage. Last but certainly not least, on that turret weapon, it can take the cyclic ion cannon, a D6 plus 3-shot weapon at strength 9 AP2 2 damage with the blast keyword, but no other special effects on this thing. On the back, it's able to take a matter auto cannon, firing 6 shots at strength 7 AP1 2 damage. It can replace its pan spectral scanner, which again ignores cover, with the Hekaton Warhead, a blast indirect fire 1-shot weapon, shooting D3 plus 3 attacks at strength 7 AP2 2 damage. That's a pretty reasonable profile against medium infantry, but doesn't really scratch vehicles too hard, so I think generally speaking, getting that pan spectral scanner bonus is going to be a pretty big deal for the Land Fortress, especially since there's no longer any dense cover for it to be impacted by. For its hull-mounted weapons, it can either take twin bolt cannons or twin ion beamers. Each of them have the sustained hits ability. Essentially, the bolt cannons are going to trade D3 sustained hits that the ion beamer has to 1 sustained hit, but double the range of their attacks, shooting 36 inches rather than the ion beamer's 18. That twin bolt cannon seems a lot like a twin heavy bolter, coming in at strength 6 instead of strength 5, and 3 shots as well with that twin linked characteristic, so they reroll their wound rolls. The ion beamer has a similar profile. It is strength 7 AP2, but only an 18-inch range, and again has that additional sustained hits effect. It definitely seems like weapons that were beams previously in 9th edition have gotten D3 sustained hits. I think that the idea is that instead of drawing a line to shoot, they're just going to be drilling into their target. It makes sense conceptually, but it is a little bit less evocative than shooting the line between the 2 models. Now, all these twin-linked weapon systems really make the Hekaton Land Fortress a huge source of wound rerolls, and that's especially when compounded with its fire support ability. We saw this previously spoiled for the Eldar Falcon, and it's interesting to see these mechanics, I guess, get applied to vehicles in different factions. Definitely seems like the vehicles or infantry units from different factions are going to be less unique than we originally expected, but get a distribution of special rules that are all going to be the same. Fire support grants full wound rerolls to a unit disembarking the Land Fortress if they fire at something that the Land Fortress has fired at previously. You do have to select one enemy unit after the Land Fortress shoots to be the target of the fire support effect, and then all of your units disembarking that Land Fortress will gain those wound rerolls against that target specifically, so you can't spread your shooting out and get rerolls against a bunch of targets, and it does only affect the unit the turn that they disembark, so future turns they will no longer be able to benefit from that effect. But it does mean that the alpha or beta strike being projected by the Land Fortress is actually pretty scary. If this thing shoots you with its big rail cannon, then disembarks a bunch of Brokir Thunderkin to shoot you with whatever insane graviton weapons they're carrying around, especially if you have judgment tokens on you, you're going to be taking a ton of damage. It also has the Deadly Demise D6 ability, able to explode for D6 mortal wounds. Now, speaking of Brokir Thunderkin, we did get one of their weapons previewed, and this is the only weapon previewed besides the ones on the data sheets. To be fair though, Votann weapon profiles are all pretty consolidated, so we've basically seen most of the weapons in the faction at this point. And it's a little bit of a downgraded version of the heavy conversion beamer that the Land Fortress can mount. It has a single attack hitting on a 4+ at a 24-inch range with strength 7 AP1 for 3 damage. However, gains that conversion and sustained hits combo. So just like the Land Fortress, if you're farther than 12 inches away from the target of your attack on a 4+, you will hit your normal hit plus D3 additional hits, then move all of those to the wound roll, potentially with +1 if you have 2 judgment tokens on your target. At that strength 7, you're wounding basically all vehicles of the game on 5s except for monoliths, and if you're disembarking a Land Fortress that has also shot at that unit, you're getting full wound rerolls. So the amount of 3 damage shooting coming out of the Thunderkin unit is actually pretty impactful. Now that was the only weapon spoiled, but before we hop off the article review, we did get one pretty spicy stratagem being spoiled. This is one that you can use with your Brokir Thunderkin to make use of those conversion beamers if you're in a firefight with your opponent. And it's very similar to one that we saw from the Adeptus Sororitas article. This is reactive reprisal and triggers after a unit with judgment tokens on it has resolved its attacks. If one of your unit was selected as the target of those attacks, you can fire back at that judgmented unit as if it was your shooting phase for 2 CP. I guess the open question for me would be whether or not judgment tokens from units being destroyed are applied immediately after the unit resolves its attacks, or whether there's like another step there. Because if a unit with 0 judgment tokens goes up and shoots a Votann unit to death, then gains 1 judgment token, I wonder if the reactive reprisal effect would trigger, assuming that they fired at 2 units, I guess. Maybe they split fired, killed 1 unit, didn't kill the other unit. Would you be able to reactive reprise? That one I'm not entirely sure of yet. And there may be timing rules in the core rules that we just haven't seen yet. But with that, that is all of the spoilers for Leagues of Votann so far in this preview article. Let me know down in the comment section what you think. Definitely a big side grade for the faction. Feels like all their data sheets are going to be a lot less powerful, but I have to imagine that the Eye of the Ancestors effects will end up being, on the whole, easier to trigger. The downside is, much like many of the other articles, we haven't seen any of the additional army support for Eye of the Ancestors. Are there different ways of applying judgment tokens? Do you have characters or special abilities or upgrades that can provide judgment tokens to your opponent's army? I don't know yet, but if there are, then it seems pretty good. Especially if we see the cost of Votann units come down a little bit. And that isn't really conducive to a mechanic that requires your own army to die to trigger it. Obviously, there's a lot of open questions, so we'll just have to see. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.